The eviction notice came on a Thursday morning, taped to my door like a public announcement of my failure. I stood there in my bathrobe, holding a cup of cold coffee, reading the words that meant I had 30 days to pack up a life I'd spent 15 years building. The house wasn't much. 3 small bedrooms and a yard that never quite looked right no matter how much I tended it, but it was mine. Or at least I thought it was until the medical bills started piling up and the bank stopped believing in second chances. I had lost my job 6 months earlier when the company downsized. Lost my savings paying for my mother's final hospital stay. And now I was losing the walls that had witnessed every version of myself I'd tried to be. People talk about rock bottom like it's a single moment, but mine felt like a slow descent through layers of loss. Each one stripping away another piece of who I thought I was until I stood hollow and unrecognizable in my own skin, wondering if there was anything left worth salvaging. I was 47 years old when everything fell apart. Though looking back, I think the falling had started long before I noticed the cracks. My name is Elena, and I had spent most of my adult life doing exactly what I was supposed to do, working hard, paying bills on time, believing that if you just kept your head down and followed the rules, life would eventually reward your efforts. I worked as an administrative manager at a mid-sized manufacturing company, the kind of job that sounds more impressive than it feels, where you spend your days organizing other people's schedules and putting out small fires before they become big ones. My house sat on a corner lot in a neighborhood that had seen better days, but still held onto a certain dignity. The paint was peeling in places I kept meaning to fix, and the front porch sagged slightly on one side, but the oak tree in the backyard provided shade in summer, and the kitchen window faced east, so morning light would stream in while I made my coffee. I had bought it with my ex-husband 20 years earlier, back when we still believed we could build something lasting together. After the divorce, I fought to keep it, taking on extra work, refinancing twice, pouring everything I had into maintaining this one piece of stability. My routine was simple and predictable. I woke at 6 every morning, made oatmeal with cinnamon the way my mother taught me, drove the same route to work, listening to NPR. Lunch was always at my desk, usually leftovers from whatever I'd cooked the night before. Evenings were spent paying bills, doing laundry, maybe watching an hour of television before bed. Looking at it now, I realize how small my world had become, how I'd narrowed my life down to just the essentials, cutting away anything that felt like excess or risk. I had a cat named Walter, an orange tabby I'd found shivering behind a dumpster 3 years earlier. He had this habit of sitting on the bathroom counter every morning while I got ready for work, watching me apply the same minimal makeup, brush my graying hair into the same low ponytail. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection and wonder when I'd started looking so tired, when the lines around my eyes had deepened into permanent grooves. I'd stopped really seeing myself, just went through the motions of maintenance without considering whether the person staring back was someone I recognized or even liked. The company I worked for had been struggling for years, though they kept that information carefully hidden from most of us. We'd see small signs, delayed bonuses, hiring freezes, whispered conversations behind closed doors, but we told ourselves it would pass, that every business had rough patches. When they called the meeting that Friday afternoon in March, I knew before anyone said a word. You develop an instinct for bad news when you've been around long enough. Can read it in the way people avoid eye contact, the careful neutrality of their expressions. They laid off 40% of the workforce that day, reading names from a list like some kind of corporate lottery where everyone loses. My name was somewhere in the middle. They gave us 2 weeks severance, a box to pack our personal items, and a number to call about Cobra health insurance that cost more per month than my mortgage payment. I walked to my car carrying that box, a coffee mug my daughter had given me, a desk calendar, a dying succulent I'd somehow kept alive for 2 years, and I felt this strange numbness, like I was watching someone else's life collapse from a safe distance. The first month after losing my job, I told myself it would be temporary. I updated my resume, applied to dozens of positions, went to 3 interviews that ended with polite rejections. The problem was my age, though no one said that directly. They'd look at my years of experience and I could see the calculation happening behind their eyes. Too expensive, too set in her ways, probably planning to retire soon anyway. I started leaving dates off my resume, but my hands gave me away. The slight arthritis in my fingers, the age spots I tried to cover with hand cream. My mother got sick 2 months after I lost my job. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, the kind where doctors use words like comfortable and quality time remaining instead of cure or recovery. She lived 2 states away and had no one else. So I drove down every weekend, then every few days, then finally moved into her small apartment to care for her through those final weeks. Medicare covered some of it, but not the medications that might buy her a few more pain-free days. Not the home health aide I hired so I could sleep for 4 hours without worrying she'd fall trying to reach the bathroom. I paid for it all with my savings account, watching the numbers shrink with each withdrawal. Then I used the credit cards, telling myself I'd pay them back once I found work, once things stabilized, once life stopped demanding more than I had to give. My mother died on a Tuesday morning in May, holding my hand, and I remember thinking that at least she wouldn't have to worry about me anymore, wouldn't have to know how completely I was failing at holding my life together. Comment below where you're watching from and share if you've ever felt like you were losing everything at once. Don't forget to subscribe. This story is about more than just survival. I had always been the responsible one. The daughter who called every Sunday, the employee who stayed late without being asked, the friend who showed up when you needed help moving or someone to listen. Being reliable had become my identity, the way I measured my worth in the world. I took pride in paying my bills early, in never missing a deadline, in being the person others could count on. But responsibility is a heavy thing to carry alone. And somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that it was okay to need help. That strength doesn't mean never bending under the weight. My marriage had ended 12 years earlier. Not with drama, but with a slow fading that made it almost easy to sign the papers. We'd grown into different people who happened to share an address, speaking mostly about logistics, sleeping on opposite sides of a bed that felt wider each year. When he moved out, I remember feeling mostly relief, grateful I wouldn't have to keep pretending we were building towards something. My daughter was 15 then, old enough to understand, but young enough to be hurt by it. She split her time between us for a few years, then left for college and built a life in Seattle that rarely included trips home. I'd rebuilt myself after the divorce, thrown myself into work and home ownership and the small satisfactions of self-sufficiency. I refinished the hardwood floors myself, learned to fix the garbage disposal from YouTube videos, planted a vegetable garden that produced more zucchini than any one person could eat. These accomplishments felt significant, proof that I didn't need anyone else to make my life work. But I'd also isolated myself without realizing it, let friendships drift, stopped accepting invitations until people stopped extending them. The manufacturing company had been my anchor for 18 years. I'd started as a receptionist and worked my way up, learning every department, making myself indispensable through sheer attention to detail and willingness to take on whatever needed doing. When they promoted me to administrative manager, I felt validated, like all the extra hours and skipped lunches had been worth it. I built my identity around that job, defined myself by my professional competence, and when they took it away, I realized how little else I had to stand on. Money had always been tight but manageable. I budgeted carefully, clipped coupons, bought clothes at thrift stores and furniture from estate sales. My house wasn't fancy, but it was paid down to half its original mortgage, and I'd saved a modest emergency fund that made me feel secure. Financial stability had been my fortress, the thing I could control when everything else felt uncertain. Watching that fortress crumble, first with the job loss, then with my mother's medical expenses, felt like watching the ground disappear beneath my feet one piece at a time. My mother and I had a complicated relationship, the kind built on duty more than easy affection. She'd raised me alone after my father left, worked 2 jobs to keep us housed and fed, and taught me through example that survival meant working harder than everyone around you. She was proud and stubborn, refused help even when she clearly needed it, and I'd inherited that same stubborn pride. Taking care of her at the end felt like finally repaying a debt I'd been carrying my whole life, even as it cost me everything I'd built. After her funeral, I drove back home with her few belongings in my trunk and $63 in my checking account. The credit cards were maxed, the mortgage was 3 months behind, and my phone wouldn't stop ringing with collection calls. I'd stopped answering. I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before going inside, staring at the house that had represented security and adult competence, knowing I was about to lose it and powerless to stop the inevitable. The eviction notice was just the beginning. 2 days later, my car wouldn't start, the engine making a grinding sound that the mechanic said would cost $1,500 to fix. I didn't have $1,500. I didn't have $150. I took the bus to job interviews, arriving sweaty and defeated, watching potential employers' faces close when I gave my current address, knowing they could smell the desperation coming off me in waves. The food in my refrigerator dwindled down to condiments and half a loaf of bread. I started skipping meals, telling myself I wasn't that hungry anyway, that I needed to lose weight. My hands shook sometimes when I tried to fill out applications online, whether from hunger or anxiety. I couldn't tell. Walter looked at me with those knowing cat eyes, and I felt like I was failing even him, rationing his food to make the bag last longer. Unable to afford the vet visit he needed for the limp he developed, I applied for unemployment, for food stamps, for every assistance program I could find, sitting in government offices with fluorescent lights and plastic chairs, filling out forms that asked me to prove over and over that I was poor enough to deserve help. The shame of it burned in my chest, sitting next to other people who looked as worn down as I felt, all of us waiting to be processed and evaluated and found worthy or wanting. I'd spent my whole life working, paying taxes, following rules, and now I needed help. I couldn't afford to refuse, even as accepting it felt like admitting defeat. Friends from my old life stopped calling. They'd reached out at first, after I lost my job, with cheerful messages about coffee dates and offers to review my resume. But as months passed and my situation didn't improve, their messages grew more sporadic, more uncomfortable. I understood I was a mirror of their own precariousness, proof that doing everything right doesn't guarantee safety. I stopped responding eventually, too exhausted to maintain the pretense that I was okay, that this was just a temporary setback. My daughter called once a week, her voice bright with her own busy life, asking how I was, in that casual way that expected a casual answer. I told her I was fine, managing, didn't want her to worry. She had her own bills, her own challenges, and I couldn't bear the thought of becoming her burden. When she mentioned planning a visit for Christmas, I told her maybe we should wait until I got more settled, until I had the house in better shape to host her. She didn't push, and I was grateful and heartbroken in equal measure. The 30-day eviction notice ticked down like a countdown clock to my complete unraveling. I packed what I could fit in boxes, donated furniture I'd saved months to buy, threw away belongings that suddenly seemed meaningless in the face of homelessness. Each item I discarded felt like shedding skin, stripping away the evidence of the life I'd tried to build. The house that had witnessed my divorce, my mother's weekend visits, my solitary dinners and quiet mornings, would soon belong to someone else, someone who could afford to keep it. I visited the homeless shelter on a Wednesday afternoon, just to see, just to know what my options were. The building smelled like industrial cleaner and desperation, full of women and children sitting on cots with their belongings in trash bags, eyes that had stopped expecting better. A social worker gave me intake forms and explained the rules. No weapons, no drugs, curfew at 9, lights out at 10. She was kind, but efficient, had done this too many times to make each person's tragedy feel unique. I walked out with the forms in my shaking hands, unable to imagine actually sleeping there, but also unable to imagine anywhere else to go. Walter was the breaking point. I couldn't take a cat to a shelter, couldn't afford to board him, couldn't keep him in my car once the house was gone. I found a no-kill rescue that agreed to take him, and the day I surrendered him, carrying his carrier into that facility and watching him disappear into the back room, something inside me shattered completely. He'd been my companion, my responsibility, my reason to come home. And losing him felt like losing the last tether to my own humanity. That night I sat in my nearly empty house among the boxes and the echoes, and I let myself fall apart. I cried until my throat hurt, until my eyes swelled shut, until the tears dried up and left me hollow. I looked at the eviction notice one more time, at the date circled in red that marked my complete failure, and I thought about how easy it would be to just stop trying, not to hurt myself, but just to stop fighting the inevitable, to let the current take me wherever it wanted to carry me, to finally stop struggling against the weight. But morning came the way it always does, indifferent to human suffering, and I woke up still breathing, still inhabiting this body that needed food and shelter, regardless of how defeated I felt. I made instant coffee with the last of the grounds, sat on the floor because I'd already sold the kitchen table, and I made a decision, not a dramatic one, not some grand moment of revelation, just a simple choice that I would keep going because not going wasn't actually an option. Not really, Not yet. I moved what I could fit into my broken car and slept in it that first night. Parked in a church parking lot where I'd heard they didn't tow. The back seat smelled like stale fast food and regret, and I couldn't stretch out fully. But it was shelter of a kind. I used the public library bathroom in the morning to wash my face, brush my teeth, make myself presentable enough for another round of job applications. The librarians didn't say anything, but I saw recognition in their eyes. I wasn't the first person to use their facilities this way. I found a job within 2 weeks. Not the kind I'd had before, but work nonetheless. A grocery store needed night shift stockers, minimum wage, no benefits, hours from 11 until 7 in the morning. The manager looked at my resume with obvious confusion, clearly wondering what I was doing applying for this position with my experience. But he needed bodies and I needed money, so we both pretended that made sense. I started that night, learning to unpack boxes and stock shelves and operate the floor buffer. My body aching in new ways, my hands developing calluses I hadn't had since I was young. The work was physically exhausting, but mentally simple. A relief after months of anxiety and complicated loss. There was something almost meditative about arranging cans on shelves, making sure the labels all face forward, creating order in a small defined space. My coworkers were mostly younger, kids working their way through college or single parents patching together multiple jobs to survive. We didn't talk much, moved through our tasks with tired efficiency, but there was a camaraderie and shared struggle. An unspoken understanding that we were all doing what we had to do. I couldn't afford an apartment, not even a studio, not with first and last month's rent and security deposit. I found a room for rent in an older woman's house, $200 a week for a space barely big enough for a twin mattress and a dresser, shared bathroom, kitchen privileges if I didn't make a mess. The woman, Mrs. Kowalski, was in her 70s, her house filled with the accumulation of a long life, photographs of people I'd never know covering every surface. She didn't ask questions about my situation, just took my first week's rent in cash and showed me where the towels were kept. Living there felt like being a ghost in someone else's life. I kept my few belongings in my room, used the bathroom only when necessary. Avoided common spaces where I might have to make conversation. Mrs. Kowalski was kind in a distant way, sometimes leaving a plate of food outside my door, never commenting on the fact that I left for work at 10:30 at night and came home exhausted at 8 in the morning. I'd sleep until afternoon, wake disoriented in the unfamiliar room, then spend the evening preparing for another shift. I started saving money with an obsessive focus that probably wasn't healthy but felt necessary. Every dollar went into an envelope I kept hidden in my room, labeled with the word escape because that's what it was. My way out of this liminal space where I existed but wasn't really living. I stopped buying anything that wasn't absolutely essential. I ate the free food the grocery store let us take home when it was about to expire. Dented cans, day-old bread, bruised fruit. I walked instead of taking the bus when weather permitted. I wore the same 3 outfits in rotation, washing them in Mrs. Kowalski's machine on my day off. The library became my refuge during waking hours before work. It was warm, quiet, free, and the librarians never made me feel unwelcome. I started taking books home, reading voraciously the way I hadn't since I was young, losing myself in other people's stories because my own felt too heavy to inhabit constantly. I read about women who'd survived wars, depressions, disasters, and I found strange comfort in knowing that human beings could endure almost anything and still find reasons to keep living. I also started using the library computers to learn new skills. If experience and age were working against me in the traditional job market, maybe I needed to become someone different, someone with capabilities that transcended those limitations. I took free online courses in basic coding, graphic design, social media marketing. I had no clear plan, just a desperate need to feel like I was building towards something rather than treading water waiting to drown. 3 months into my grocery store job, a regular customer started talking to me during my shift. She was maybe 60, always came in at 2 in the morning for tea and cat food, and we'd developed a nodding acquaintance. One night she asked if I did any freelance work, said she'd noticed me redesigning the store's bulletin board displays, and they looked more professional than anything she could do. She ran a small nonprofit that helped elder adults with technology, needed someone to manage their social media and create simple graphics for flyers. She could pay $50 a week cash, Just a few hours of work. I said yes before she finished explaining. And that tiny freelance job became my first step back towards something resembling my old competence. I spent my afternoons before work creating Facebook posts, designing event flyers, building an email newsletter. The work was simple, but it reminded me that I had skills, that I could create value beyond stocking shelves. The woman was pleased, started referring me to other small nonprofits and local businesses. And slowly my freelance income began to grow. 6 months after losing everything, I had saved nearly $3,000 in my envelope, and the freelance work had grown to the point where I was making almost as much from it as from the grocery store. I started looking at studio apartments again, calculating whether I could afford first and last month's rent plus deposit, whether I could risk leaving the security of Mrs. Kowalski's spare room for the vulnerability of my own lease. I found a place above a nail salon, 400 square feet with a kitchenette and a bathroom that worked most of the time. It wasn't much, but the windows faced west and caught afternoon light, and it was mine, in a way. Nothing had been mine since losing the house. The landlord wanted references, and I gave him the grocery store manager and my main freelance client, held my breath while he called them, exhaled when he said okay and handed me the keys. Moving day was simple. I didn't have much to move. A mattress I bought off Craigslist, a card table and folding chair, my clothes and trash bags, my growing collection of library books. Mrs. Kowalski stood on her porch watching me load my car, and when I went to thank her, she handed me a box of kitchen supplies, plates, cups, silverware, a can opener. She said every home needs basics, and I hugged her with tears in my eyes, grateful for kindness I hadn't earned, didn't deserve, but desperately needed. The freelance work kept growing. Word of mouth in the nonprofit sector meant new clients regularly, and I realized I was building an actual business without having intended to. I created a simple website, started calling myself a freelance marketing consultant, raised my rates slightly each time I took on a new client. A year after losing my corporate job, I was making more money working for myself than I'd made at the company that laid me off. And I was doing it on my own terms. I was able to quit the grocery store eventually, giving notice to the manager who'd taken a chance on me when I needed it most. My last shift, stocking shelves at 3 in the morning, I felt this overwhelming gratitude for work that had seemed like rock bottom at the time, but had actually been the foundation I rebuilt on. My coworkers signed a card, and I realized we'd become something like friends through shared exhaustion and small kindnesses. That community exists in unexpected places when you're open to seeing it. My business kept growing. I hired a college student to help with the workload, taught her what I'd learned, paid her fairly because I remembered what it felt like to need every dollar. We worked from my tiny studio, my card table serving as our office, taking client calls on my cell phone and delivering professional work despite the unprofessional setting. Clients didn't care where I worked from as long as I delivered results. And I always delivered results because failure was no longer an option I could afford to consider. 2 years after the eviction, I moved into a real apartment, one with a separate bedroom and a functional kitchen, and windows that didn't stick. I bought furniture slowly, piece by piece, choosing items I actually liked rather than whatever was cheapest. I adopted a new cat from the same rescue where I'd surrendered Walter, a gray tabby with white paws, who I named Hope because I'd finally earned the right to feel that again. My daughter came to visit that Christmas, the one I'd canceled 3 years earlier, and she walked into my apartment and said she was proud of me. We cooked dinner together, talking about my business, her life in Seattle, the ways we'd both been protecting each other from worry. I told her the truth about those lost years, about the eviction and the car sleeping and the nights I wasn't sure I'd survive my own despair. She cried, and I cried, and then we laughed about how stubborn we both were, how we'd inherited that from my mother, how maybe that stubbornness was the thing that saved us both. 3 years after losing everything, my business had grown enough that I hired 2 more employees and rented actual office space, a small suite above a coffee shop with exposed brick and good light. I still kept my rates reasonable, still focused primarily on nonprofits and small businesses that couldn't afford big agencies, finding purpose in helping organizations that helped others. The work felt meaningful in a way my corporate job never had, connected to community and impact rather than just profit. I reconnected with old friends cautiously, reaching out to a few people I'd lost touch with during my hardest months. Some responded warmly, suggesting coffee dates where we caught up, and I told edited versions of my story. Others never replied, and I made peace with that, understanding that relationships require maintenance I hadn't been able to provide. I built new friendships too, with other freelancers and small business owners. People who understood the precariousness of self-employment and the satisfaction of building something yourself. Money was no longer the constant source of anxiety it had been. I lived simply, still cautious with spending, still saving a percentage of every payment in case everything fell apart again. But the fear had loosened its grip, replaced with a confidence built on knowing I could survive the worst and come back from it. I'd learned to live on almost nothing, which meant everything above that felt like abundance. I found a therapist I could afford through a sliding scale clinic. Started processing the trauma of those lost years in weekly sessions. We talked about shame and failure and the myth of bootstraps, about how the system is designed to punish poverty and how surviving that punishment takes more strength than people acknowledge. She helped me see that losing everything wasn't my fault, that I'd done nothing wrong except be human in a world that doesn't forgive human vulnerability. My body slowly recovered from the stress of that period. I started sleeping through the night again. My hands stopped shaking. The weight I'd lost in those hungry months came back in healthier ways. I joined a gym that cost $20 a month, started taking walks in the morning before work, relearned what it felt like to inhabit my body without constant fear. The gray in my hair had spread, but I let it, decided it looked distinguished rather than old, proof of survival rather than decline. I drove past my old house sometimes, the one I'd lost to foreclosure. New people lived there now, had painted it a different color, put up a fence. That changed the whole character of the yard. I felt nothing looking at it, no longing or regret, just a mild curiosity about that version of myself who thought stability came from owning property rather than owning your own resilience. That house had been beautiful, but also a trap, tying me to a life I'd built for someone else's approval rather than my own satisfaction. I'm 52 now. 5 years past the eviction notice that felt like the end of the world. My business is stable. My apartment is comfortable. My life is quiet, but full in ways that matter. I work with clients I respect, employ people I care about, wake up most mornings feeling grateful rather than anxious. It's not the life I planned, not the trajectory I thought I was on when I had that corporate job and that house and that fragile sense of security. It's better. Losing everything taught me that security is an illusion, that the things we think define us, jobs, houses, marriages, savings accounts can disappear overnight through no fault of our own. But it also taught me that what remains after everything else is stripped away is actually enough. I remained. My ability to adapt, to learn, to keep going, even when going seemed impossible. That's the foundation. Everything else is built on. And unlike houses or careers, no one can take it away. I think about all the women I met during those hard years. In government offices, in library bathrooms, on night shifts, in shelters I never actually stayed in but easily could have. Women who'd done everything right and still ended up broke, homeless, desperate. Women who worked multiple jobs and still couldn't afford rent. Women whose only crime was being human in a system that punishes humanity. I think about them, and I know my story isn't special, isn't unique, is actually devastatingly common. The only difference is I found a way back, and not everyone does. And that's not because I'm stronger or smarter or more deserving. The shame of that period took years to shed. I'd internalized the message that poverty was personal failure, that needing help meant I wasn't trying hard enough. Therapy helped me understand that those messages were lies designed to keep people from questioning why we live in a country where working full-time doesn't guarantee survival, where medical bills can destroy decades of careful saving, where one job loss can spiral into homelessness. Understanding that didn't erase my experience, but it helped me stop carrying it as personal shame. My daughter and I are closer now than we were before everything fell apart. She tells me I'm braver than she realized, and I tell her that bravery is just another word for not having alternatives. We talk on the phone weekly, visit a few times a year, have built an adult relationship based on honesty rather than the performance of being fine. She knows I struggled, knows I almost didn't make it, knows I kept that from her because I didn't want to be her burden. Now she tells me that letting people help isn't burden, it's love, and I'm trying to learn that lesson. I still have moments of anxiety, still wake sometimes in the night, calculating bills in my head, still feel my chest tighten when clients pay late or expenses run high. The trauma of those years left marks that haven't fully faded. But I've learned to sit with that anxiety rather than let it consume me, to remember that I've survived worse, that I have skills and resilience and the knowledge that I can rebuild from nothing if I have to. Hope, my gray cat, is sitting on my desk right now while I work, purring in that rhythmic way that always makes me smile. I think about Walter sometimes, hope he found a good home, hope he's being loved by someone who has more stability than I had to offer him then. Surrendering him was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But I'm learning that sometimes love means letting go of what you can't carry. And that doesn't make you a failure. Just human. If I could go back and tell that woman holding the eviction notice what I know now, I'd tell her that this isn't the end, even though it feels like it. I'd tell her that she's stronger than she realizes, that she'll find ways to survive she can't imagine yet, that the life on the other side of this loss will be different, but not lesser. I'd tell her to be gentler with herself, to ask for help sooner. To understand that needing support doesn't erase all the years she spent being strong alone. I pour my morning coffee now in my small apartment kitchen. Watch the sun come through the windows. Listen to Hope purr from his spot on the counter. My life is smaller now than it was in that house with the oak tree. But it's mine in a way nothing was before. Built by my own hands, sustained by my own efforts, shaped according to my own values rather than someone else's expectations. I am enough, exactly as I am. And that simple truth was worth losing everything to finally understand.